They were lined up like meat, faces hidden, silent. The smallest one whispered a name, her name, and everything inside her snapped. The dust of Dyer's Gulch tasted of rust and forgetting. It settled on everything, a fine red powder that clung to the warped timbers of the saloon, the cracked leather of saddles, and the hollows of Magda's own face. She had come to this place not for salvation, but for noise. Any noise to fill the cavernous silence of the homestead, a quiet so profound it echoed with the ghost of a cry she'd never heard. Her husband Elias had been gone 2 winters, taken by the same fever that had stolen the breath from their stillborn daughter before she'd ever drawn one. He'd left behind a silence that was a living thing, a predator that stalked the halls of their home, and Magda had fled it, seeking the crude clamor of men and commerce, anything to prove she still existed. But the noise of Dyer's Gulch was a thin veneer over a deeper, more sinister quiet. It was the quiet of men who had traded their souls for a patch of unforgiving land, the quiet of secrets buried just beneath the surface of the hard-packed earth. Today, the noise was different. It was the shuffling of boots, the low murmur of bids, the clink of coin. It was the sound of the twice-yearly trade, where livestock and goods were bartered and sold. And children. They were brought in on a flatbed wagon, a grim harvest from some distant ravaged town, their origins a story no one cared to learn. There were 3 of them this time, standing on the auction block outside the general store, their small forms stark against the brutal afternoon sun. A coarse burlap sack, cinched at the neck with rough twine, covered each of their heads. They were anonymous, interchangeable, their humanity erased by a simple piece of cloth. The crowd was mostly men, ranchers and miners with eyes like chips of flint, assessing the children as they would a mule or a plow horse. A strong boy for the fields, a girl for the kitchens. It was a transaction, nothing more. Magda stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand clutching the small, smooth, silver pendant she wore beneath her dress. It was a locket, heart-shaped, meant for a lock of hair that had never grown. She had polished it every day for 5 years, her thumb tracing the delicate engraving of a single star, until the metal was warm with her grief. She hadn't come for this. She had come for flour and salt, for the mundane necessities that tethered her to the world of the living. But she couldn't look away. The sight of them, so small and still, the sacks a monstrous mockery of a face, stirred something cold and sharp in her gut. It was the horror of it, the raw, unvarnished cruelty that this world could inflict upon the helpless. It was a reflection of the cruelty that had visited her own life, the thief that had come in the night and stolen her future. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas, with a voice like gravel, began his spiel. "Sturdy stock, these ones. Healthy. Won't give you no trouble." He gestured to the tallest, a boy whose hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. The bidding was brisk, heartless. The boy was sold to a rancher with a brand-scarred face and a whip coiled at his hip. He was led away, his small shoulders rigid, the sack on his head bobbing with each step. Then the second child, a girl, was sold to the saloon owner, a woman with eyes as hard and empty as the bottles she served. Magda watched, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. She felt a phantom kick beneath her ribs, a memory of a life that had never been. Then it was the last one's turn, the smallest of the 3. So small, she looked as if a strong gust of wind could carry her away. She stood with her head bowed, her thin arms wrapped around herself as if for warmth, though the sun beat down with a merciless heat. The silence stretched, the crowd's interest waning. This one was a runt, a gamble. Too frail for heavy labor, too young for much else. Silas cleared his throat, about to start the bidding low, when a sound, barely audible, cut through the air. It was a whisper, a thread of sound so faint it might have been the wind sighing through the eaves of the store. But it wasn't the wind. It came from the smallest child, from behind the suffocating darkness of the sack. A single word, breathed out like a prayer. Magda. The world tilted on its axis. The noise of the gulch, the heat of the sun, the faces of the men, it all fell away. There was only that one word, a name she hadn't heard spoken with such gentleness since Elias had whispered it in the dark. It couldn't be. A trick of the heat, a figment of her grief-addled mind. But then the child swayed, a fragile reed in the wind, and whispered it again, a little louder this time, a question and a plea, all in one. Magda? Something inside her, a dam of sorrow and rage she had painstakingly constructed for 5 years, shattered. It was a physical sensation, a violent splintering in her chest. The grief that had been a dull, constant ache erupted into a searing, white-hot fury. It was not just her name. It was the way it was said, with a familiarity that defied all logic. It was the sound of a child calling for its mother, her child, the one she had buried in a small wooden box at the foot of the lone pine tree on the hill behind their house. She didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was at the foot of the auction block, her hand outstretched, the silver locket swinging from its chain. The men turned to look at her, their faces a mixture of surprise and contempt. The mad widow from the hollow, come to town for more than just supplies. But she didn't see them. She saw only the small, sack-covered head, the tiny form that seemed to be shrinking into itself. How much? Her voice was a croak, a sound torn from the depths of her soul. Silas, taken aback, stammered, "Well, now, Magda, How? Much." It was not a question. It was a demand, forged in the fires of a pain so deep it had become a weapon. She paid. She paid with the last of the money Elias had left her, the coins she had hoarded for a harsh winter or a new roof. She paid without haggling, her eyes never leaving the child, and when the transaction was done, she didn't stop there. A wild, desperate thought had taken root in her mind. If this one knew her name, what did the others know? What secrets were hidden behind those terrible masks? "The other two," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll take them as well." A murmur went through the crowd. The rancher and the saloon owner looked at her, their expressions hardening. But Magda met their gazes with a ferocity that made them flinch. She laid more money on the barrelhead, a reckless, defiant act that sealed her fate. She was no longer just the grieving widow. She was something else now, something untamed and dangerous. She led them away from the auction block, 3 small, silent figures trailing behind her, their heads still shrouded in burlap. The townsfolk watched her go, their whispers following her like a swarm of angry bees. She didn't care. She had walked into Dyer's Gulch a ghost, and she was walking out a mother. She didn't know their names, their faces, or the horrors they had endured. She only knew that one of them had spoken her name in the darkness, and that was enough. It was everything. The walk back to the homestead was a blur. The sun beat down, the dust rose in choking clouds, but Magda felt none of it. She was in a world of her own, a world where the impossible had just happened. The children followed her without a word, their small feet stumbling on the uneven ground. She held the hand of the smallest one, her fingers wrapped around a wrist so thin it felt as if it might snap. The child's hand was limp in hers, a passive weight that sent a fresh wave of anguish through her. When they reached the homestead, the silence she had fled rushed out to meet them. But this time, it was different. It was not the empty, predatory silence of her grief. It was a watchful, waiting silence, a silence that held its breath. The house, which had felt like a tomb, now seemed to be holding a vigil. The lone pine on the hill stood like a sentinel, its branches reaching for the sky. She led them into the kitchen, the heart of the house, the room where she had spent so many hours alone, staring at the cold hearth. She sat them down at the long wooden table Elias had built, their small forms dwarfed by the heavy chairs. For a long moment, She just looked at them, 3 burlap sacks in a row, a tableau of unspeakable sorrow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What had she done? What madness had possessed her? With trembling hands, she reached for the twine on the sack of the child nearest to her, the boy. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The twine came loose, and she slowly, carefully lifted the sack. The face that looked up at her was thin and pale, smudged with dirt. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue, were wide, with a terror so profound it stole her breath. He stared at her, his lips parted, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, but his eyes held the weary knowledge of a man who had seen too much. There was a long, jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a white line against his grimy skin. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze a silent scream. She moved to the next child, the girl who had been sold to the saloon owner. Her hands were steadier now, her resolve hardening. She lifted the sack, and another pair of eyes, dark and wary, met hers. This girl was older, perhaps 10, with a defiant tilt to her chin and a mouth set in a stubborn line. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark curls, and there was a bruise, faded but still visible, on her cheek. She too said nothing, but her silence was different from the boys. It was a wall, a fortress she had built around herself. Finally, she came to the smallest one, the one who had spoken her name. Her heart was a wild drum in her ears. She knelt down, so she was at eye level with the child, her hands hovering for a moment before she touched the sack. She was afraid of what she would see and what she wouldn't, afraid that the voice had been a hallucination, a cruel trick of her own desperate longing. She lifted the sack. The child's head was bowed, her face hidden by a curtain of pale, almost white hair. Magda gently, so gently, brushed the hair away from her face. The child looked up, and Magda's breath caught in her throat. The girl's eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in a way that suggested they had never been open. Her eyelids were smooth, unlined, as if they had been sealed shut. But it was not her blindness that made Magda's world stop turning. It was her face. It was a face she had seen only in her dreams, a face she had constructed from a desperate hope and a mother's intuition. It was the face of her daughter. The daughter she had held cold and still for a few precious moments before Elias had taken her away to be buried. The girl tilted her head as if listening to the frantic beating of Magda's heart. And then she smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was a smile of recognition, a smile that said, "I know you." And in that moment, Magda knew. She didn't know how or why, but she knew. This was her child, her lost child, returned to her from the realm of ghosts and dreams. The world, which had been a desolate, meaningless landscape, suddenly blazed with a terrifying, sacred light. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken name of her daughter, a name she had whispered only to the wind and the stars. She reached out and drew the child into her arms, holding her with a fierce protective love that was so intense it was a kind of pain. The girl buried her face in Magda's shoulder, her small body trembling. And for the first time in 5 years, Magda Hollow wept. She wept for the years she had lost, for the child she had mourned, for the miracle she held in her arms. She wept until the sun went down and the stars came out, a shower of silver in the vast, dark sky. The other 2 children watched, their silence a fragile, uncertain thing in the face of a grief and a joy so immense it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. They were no longer just orphans bought at a trade. They were witnesses, they were family, and Magda knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would die before she let anyone take them from her again. The days that followed were a strange, dreamlike dance of discovery and healing. Magda moved through them in a haze of disbelief and fierce, unwavering purpose. She named them, not with new names, but with the ones she felt they already owned. The boy, with his haunted blue eyes and the scar that told a story he couldn't yet voice, became Caleb. The older girl, with her defiant stare and the wall she kept around her heart, became Elara. And the smallest one, her daughter, the child of her dreams, she called Lily. It was the name she and Elias had chosen, the name engraved on the tiny wooden cross that marked an empty grave. Lily was a creature of sound and touch. She navigated the house with a preternatural grace, her small hands trailing along the walls, her bare feet seeming to read the texture of the floorboards. She hummed constantly, a stream of wordless melodies that were both heartbreakingly sad and strangely comforting. Sometimes they were tunes Magda had never heard before. Other times, a fragment of a lullaby would emerge, a tune Magda had hummed to the swell of her own belly, a secret song shared only between a mother and her unborn child. Each time it happened, it was a fresh shock to Magda's heart, another piece of impossible proof that this child was hers. Caleb remained silent, his trauma a locked room to which Magda had no key. He would sit for hours at the kitchen window, staring out at the lone pine on the hill, his expression unreadable. He ate what was put in front of him, his movements stiff and mechanical. But Magda saw the way his eyes followed Lily, a flicker of something protective in their depths. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, she would see him trace the scar on his face, his touch so light it was almost a caress. Elara was the most difficult. She was a whirlwind of suspicion and anger, her dark eyes missing nothing. She challenged Magda at every turn, her silence a weapon she wielded with expert precision. She refused to eat at the table with them, preferring to take her plate to a corner of the room and eat with her back to them. She tested the boundaries of Magda's patience, pushing and prodding, waiting for the kindness to crack and reveal the cruelty she clearly expected. But Magda did not crack. She met Elara's anger with a quiet, unyielding tenderness. She mended the girl's torn dress, her stitches small and even. She brushed the tangles from her dark curls, her touch gentle despite the girl's flinching. She saw the fear beneath the fury, the desperate need for a safe harbor in a world that had offered her nothing but storms. One evening, as a storm gathered over the gulch, the wind rattling the window panes, Magda sat by the fire, mending one of Elias's old shirts for Caleb. Lily was asleep in her lap, her breathing soft and even. Elara was in her usual corner, watching the flames, her face a mask of sullen indifference. Suddenly, a sound from outside made them all start. It was the sharp, clear ring of a bell. But there was no bell on the homestead, save for the small one on the collar of the milk cow, and she was safe in the barn. The sound came again, closer this time, a single, resonant peal that seemed to hang in the storm-charged air. Magda's blood ran cold. She knew that sound. It was the sound of the bell on the door of the general store in Dyer's Gulch, the bell that had rung as she'd led the children away. But that was miles away. It was impossible. Elara's head shot up, her eyes wide with a fear that momentarily broke through her defenses. Caleb, who had been dozing by the hearth, was suddenly wide awake, his body tense as a coiled spring. Only Lily slept on, undisturbed. Magda rose, her heart pounding. She went to the door and peered out into the churning darkness. The wind tore at her hair, whipping her dress around her legs. There was nothing there, just the wind and the rain and the vast, empty night. But as she was about to close the door, her eyes caught a flicker of movement by the woodpile, a shadow detaching itself from the other shadows. A man. Her first thought was of the rancher, the man with the brand-scarred face who had bought Caleb, or the saloon owner come to reclaim Elara. She grabbed the shotgun Elias had kept loaded by the door, her hands surprisingly steady. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharp and clear above the howl of the wind. The figure stepped forward into the faint light spilling from the doorway. It was not the rancher or the saloon owner. It was a man she had never seen before, a stranger with a face as weathered as the land itself. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the dusty clothes of a traveler. He held up his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm, ma'am," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I'm just passing through. Saw your light." Magda did not lower the shotgun. "State your business." The man's eyes flickered past her, into the warm light of the kitchen. He saw the two children huddled by the fire, their faces pale with fear. His gaze lingered for a moment, a strange expression of sorrow and understanding in his eyes. "I have no business," he said, turning his gaze back to her. "Just a story I was told to deliver." "I'm not interested in stories," Magda said, her grip tightening on the gun. "This one is for you," the man insisted. "It's about a man who lost 3 children in a fire, a man who carved their names on a spoon so he would never forget them." Magda froze. A carved spoon. The day after she had brought the children home, she had found a small wooden spoon in the pocket of her apron, a spoon she had never seen before. It was intricately carved with 3 names, Caleb, Ilara, and Lily. She had assumed she had picked it up somewhere in her days, a stray object from the wreckage of their former lives. But now, this stranger, this ghost in the storm, was speaking of it. "Who are you?" she whispered, the shotgun suddenly heavy in her hands. The man smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Just a traveler," he repeated. "A messenger. He wanted you to know. He wanted you to know they were loved." And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the darkness. Magda stood in the doorway for a long time, the rain soaking her dress, the wind chilling her to the bone. The bell did not ring again. She went back inside and closed the door, her mind reeling. She looked at the children, her children, and saw them not just as survivors of some unknown horror, but as the beloved children of a man who had carved their names on a spoon, a man who had sent a messenger through a storm to tell her so. The world, which had already been turned upside axle, tilted again, revealing a new, deeper layer of mystery and grace. That night, something shifted in the house. The fear that had been a constant, low-level hum began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of peace. Ilara, for the first time, did not retreat to her corner. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk, her eyes fixed on Magda with a new, uncertain curiosity. Caleb, too, seemed to relax, the rigid lines of his body softening. Later, as Magda was tucking Lily into the small cot she had set up next to her own bed, the child reached out and touched her face, her small, cool fingers tracing the lines of worry around Magda's eyes. "Don't be sad," she whispered, her voice as soft as moth wings. "He's watching. He's always watching." Magda's heart ached with a love so fierce it was almost unbearable. She kissed the child's forehead, her lips brushing against the smooth, sealed eyelids. "I know," she whispered back. "I know he is." The next morning, Magda found Caleb sitting at the kitchen table, the carved spoon in his hands. He was tracing the names with his finger, his lips moving silently. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time since he had arrived, he spoke. "He made this for us," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Before the fire." It was a beginning, a small tentative step out of the darkness. Magda sat down opposite him, her heart too full for words. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared unspoken history, a history that was slowly, painfully coming to light. A few days later, a new kind of terror arrived. It came in the form of a man on a fine black horse, a man whose face Magda recognized with a jolt of cold dread. It was the rancher, the man with the brand-scarred face who had bought Caleb at the auction. He rode up to the house as if he owned it, his eyes sweeping over the property with a proprietary air. "I've come for my property," he said, his voice as hard and unforgiving as the land he worked. He didn't dismount, his posture arrogant and menacing. Magda stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun once again in her hands. "He's not your property," she said, her voice low and steady. "He's my son." The rancher laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the quiet air. "You paid for him, I'll give you that. But a deal's a deal. I need a hand on the ranch. I'll pay you back what you spent, with a little extra for your trouble." "He's not for sale," Magda said, her knuckles white on the stock of the gun. The rancher's eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool, woman. That boy has a debt to pay. I know his kind. He's a thief, stole from his last master. That's how he got that scar on his face. A lesson he didn't learn too well, it seems." Magda's blood ran cold. A thief, a scar. The pieces of Caleb's story were falling into place, each one more terrible than the last. But it didn't matter. It didn't change anything. "Get off my land," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that was cold and pure. The rancher stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a venomous contempt. He looked past her, at the small face of Caleb peering out from behind the curtain of the kitchen window. He smiled, a cruel, predatory smile. "This ain't over," he said, and with a sharp tug on the reins, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in his wake. The threat hung over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Magda knew he would be back. Men like that did not give up easily. They saw the world in terms of ownership and possession, and they did not tolerate defiance. The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Magda found herself starting at every sound, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the sight of a black horse. The fear seemed to galvanize Alara. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. She became Magda's shadow, her dark eyes constantly watchful. She took over the task of looking after Lily, her touch surprisingly gentle, her voice soft as she guided the blind child through the house. She and Caleb formed an unspoken alliance, a silent pact to protect their small, fragile family. One afternoon, as Magda was hanging laundry on the line, she saw it. The glint of sun on metal, far down the road. A wagon, and riding alongside it, a man on a black horse. The rancher. He wasn't alone this time. He had brought 2 other men with him, rough-looking characters with guns at their hips. A cold, hard knot of dread formed in Magda's stomach. This was it, the moment she had been fearing. She ran back to the house, her heart pounding. "Caleb! Ilara! Get Lily and hide!" she yelled, her voice tight with urgency. "In the root cellar! And don't come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Caleb and Ilara exchanged a look of terror, but they didn't hesitate. Ilara scooped Lily up into her arms, and Caleb led the way to the small hidden door of the root cellar. He looked back at Magda, his blue eyes wide with a question he couldn't ask. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. "Just stay hidden." She watched them disappear into the darkness of the cellar, and then she turned to face the men who were now dismounting in her yard. She stood on the porch, the shotgun held loosely in her hands, her face a mask of calm she was far from feeling. "I told you to get off my land," she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. The rancher, whose name she now knew to be Jeb, sneered at her. "And I told you I'd be back. I've come for the boy, and for the trouble you've caused me." He gestured to the other men. "Search the house." "You'll do no such thing," Magda said, raising the shotgun. The first man who takes a step onto this porch will be the last step he ever takes." Jeb laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't expected this much fight from a lone woman. "You're a feisty one, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered, and you're alone." "She's not alone." The voice came from the side of the house, low and steady. A figure stepped out from behind the rain barrel, a rifle held loosely in his hands. It was the traveler, the messenger from the storm. He moved with a quiet, deadly grace, his eyes fixed on Jeb and his men. Jeb's face paled. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a friend," the traveler said, his voice calm and even. "A friend who doesn't take kindly to men who threaten women and children." The standoff stretched, the air thick with tension. The two hired guns looked at Jeb, their confidence wavering. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They had come to intimidate a lone woman, not to face down a man who looked as if he knew how to use the rifle he was holding. Jeb, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, made his decision. "This isn't worth it," he snarled, and with a final venomous glare at Magda, he and his men mounted their horses and rode away, their retreat as ignominious as their arrival had been arrogant. Magda's knees felt weak with relief. She lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling. The traveler watched them go, his expression unreadable. He then turned to her, his eyes soft with a gentle concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "I am now," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thanks to you." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He was older than she had first thought, his face lined with a sorrow that mirrored her own. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice filled with a desperate need to understand. He smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "My name is Samuel," he said, "and I was their father." The world tilted once more, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. The messenger, the father, the man who had carved their names on a spoon. He was here. He was real. "The fire," she began, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "I thought I lost them all," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I was away trading. When I got back, there was nothing left, just smoke and ash. They told me they were all gone. But they weren't," Magda whispered. "They survived. Someone pulled them out," Samuel said, his voice filled with a wondering awe. "A neighbor. But he was a coward. He was afraid of the man who set the fire, a man who wanted my land. So he sold them. He sold my children to the traders." The cruelty of it, the casual, thoughtless brutality, took Magda's breath away. "Jeb?" she asked, a cold certainty dawning in her. Samuel nodded. "The same. He thought he had gotten rid of me and my family. He didn't count on them surviving, and he didn't count on me coming back. He had been tracking them for months, following the cold trail of the child traders, his heart fueled by a desperate, flickering hope. He had heard whispers of a blind girl who sang sad songs, of a boy with a scar on his face, of a fierce older sister who protected them both. And the trail had finally led him here, to this small, isolated homestead, to the woman who had bought his children. "I saw you," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "I saw you at the auction. I saw the way you looked at them. I knew they would be safe with you." The root cellar door creaked open, and 3 small heads appeared, their faces pale and frightened. Caleb saw Samuel, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "Papa," he whispered, the word a fragile, hopeful prayer. Samuel's face crumpled. He dropped the rifle and opened his arms, and Caleb ran to him, burying his face in his father's chest. Alara followed, her tough exterior finally dissolving into tears. And then Magda, her own eyes streaming, led Lily to him, placing the child's hand in her father's. He knelt down, his hands tracing the features of his children's faces as if memorizing them all over again. He looked at Lily, at her sealed eyes, and a fresh wave of grief and love washed over him. "My sweet girl," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "My sweet, brave girl." They were a family, reunited in the most impossible of circumstances. A family forged in fire and loss, brought together by a mother's grief and a father's unwavering love. But their story was not over. The shadow of Jeb still loomed over them, a threat that could not be ignored. That night, as they sat around the fire, a new kind of family, Samuel told them his plan. He was not a man of violence, but he was a man of justice. He would not let Jeb get away with what he had done. He would go to the nearest town with a real sheriff, a town not under the thumb of men like Jeb, and he would tell his story. He would see that justice was done. Magda knew he had to go, but a cold fear gripped her heart. What if Jeb came back while he was gone? What if he tried to take the children again? "I'm not leaving you unprotected," Samuel said, as if reading her thoughts. He gave her a pistol, smaller and lighter than the shotgun, and showed her how to use it. "And I'll be back," he promised, his eyes meeting hers over the heads of their sleeping children. "I'll be back for my family." He left at dawn, a solitary figure riding towards the rising sun. Magda watched him go, her heart a mixture of hope and fear. The days that followed were filled with a tense, watchful waiting. The children, though overjoyed to have their father back in their lives, were subdued, their play shadowed by the unspoken threat that still lingered. One afternoon, as Magda was in the barn, milking the cow, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A child's scream. It was Alara. She ran out of the barn, the pistol Samuel had given her in her hand. The yard was empty, but the door to the house was ajar. She crept towards it, her heart pounding in her chest. She peered inside. The kitchen was in disarray. A chair was overturned, a plate shattered on the floor, and there, in the middle of the room, was Jeb. He had Caleb by the arm, his face a mask of triumph. Alara was on the floor, a red mark on her cheek where he had struck her. Lily was huddled in a corner, her small body trembling. "I told you I'd be back," Jeb sneered, his eyes glittering with a malevolent light. "And this time, I'm not leaving empty-handed." He started to drag Caleb towards the door, but Magda was there, blocking his path, the pistol aimed squarely at his chest. "Let him go," she said, her voice a low, deadly growl. Jeb laughed. "You're not going to shoot me, little lady. You don't have the guts." "Try me," Magda said, her finger tightening on the trigger. For a long, tense moment, they stared at each other, two predators locked in a battle of wills. And then, from behind Jeb, a small figure rose. It was Lily. She stood up, her face turned towards the man who had torn her family apart, her sealed eyes seeming to see right through him. And then she spoke. Her voice was not the soft whisper Magda was used to. It was clear and strong, filled with a power that seemed to come from another world. "You can't have him," she said. "He's ours." Jeb, startled, turned to look at the blind child. And in that moment of distraction, Magda acted. She didn't shoot him. She didn't need to. She brought the butt of the pistol down on his head with all the force of her rage and her grief and her love. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. It was over. The threat was gone. But the fight had taken its toll. Magda sank to her knees, her body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline and the fear. The children rushed to her, their arms wrapping around her in a tangle of love and relief. When Samuel returned a few days later, with the sheriff and a posse in tow, he found them not as victims, but as survivors, as a family. Jeb was taken away, his reign of terror finally at an end, and the homestead, which had once been a place of silence and sorrow, was filled with the sounds of laughter and life. Samuel stayed. He couldn't leave. He and Magda, two souls scarred by loss, found in each other a solace and a companionship they had never expected to find again. They were a strange, patchwork family, a family born of tragedy and miracles, a family chosen not by blood, but by a love that was strong enough to defy death itself. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, Magda was sitting on the porch with Lily in her lap. They were singing one of their secret songs, a lullaby that had traveled across the veil between worlds. Samuel was in the field with Caleb and Alara, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. The house behind them was warm and bright, a beacon of hope in the vast, wild landscape. Lily stopped singing and tilted her head, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Mama," she said, her voice soft and clear, "can I see you?" Magda's heart constricted. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish you could." Lily smiled, a radiant, knowing smile. "I can," she said. "I can see you with my heart." She reached up and touched Magda's face, her small fingers tracing the lines of her smile. And then she did something she had never done before. She opened her eyes. They were a startling, luminous blue, the color of a summer sky. They were clear and bright and filled with an ancient, loving wisdom. They looked at Magda, really looked at her, with a recognition that was so profound it was a kind of prayer. The sack fell from her head, and the girl smiled like she'd been found again.